So maybe you are one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and after some period of time, you started doing some research about the organization and realized it isn't quite what you thought it was. And so now you find yourself in a predicament of what do you do now? How do you help your family and friends to realize what kind of an organization that they're a part of to perhaps help them to be able to get out? And how do you do so in the safest way possible in order for you to be able to maintain your family and your friends? Well, perhaps you aren't one of Jehovah's Witnesses, but you have a family member or a friend who is, and you basically are in a similar situation of you just want to be able to help them. Well, let's discuss some of the ways and perhaps some tips and tricks that might help you to be able to do that. So let's get into it. I know you probably have a wide range of emotions now that you figured out that the organization isn't quite what you thought it was. You could be angry, upset, sad, all of these things at the same time. And if you've been a witness for any length of time, especially raised in it, you've been born and raised with the thought of being able to stand up for the truth and be able to speak it. So now you're in a difficult situation where you realize you do need to stand up and to try to stand up for what is true. Probably the first tip that I would have for you is to not talk to others about it, at least not yet. Wait until you get a good solid plan together as to how you want to accomplish it, what your goals are going to be. And there are a few different reasons for that. One of them being that if you explode all of the information that you know about Jehovah's Witnesses on them, they are just going to immediately shut down and you might not ever have a chance to have a conversation with them again. And the other part of it is that if you do start talking about negative things regarding Jehovah's Witnesses, you will instantly be labeled as either an apostate or at the bare minimum, having apostate thinking. So if you're in a situation where you are perhaps a PMO, physically in, mentally out, and you're trying to plan a successful fade, you really want to tread carefully as to how you do this, plan your steps, and make sure that you're doing things in a way that helps keep you as safe as possible as well. And if you are one of those who has a family member who's in and you're just trying to help them with it, these tips also can be pretty helpful for you because really the same information applies as far as if you were to come out and talk with them about all of these negative things, that will still cause a shutdown in their mind, even though you might not even be a witness. My next key point would be do not go to the elders with the doubts that you have. Now, there are various reasons as to why I recommend against doing that. But I know that can be a tough thing to think about because as a witness, especially if you've been born and raised in it, you might be thinking, well, the elders, they've been trained, they've received all this special instruction from the governing body to help them to deal with this apostate thinking and information. And so you might be thinking that they could help you with it, or that if you bring them this information, they're going to clearly see how many things are wrong with the organization, and they're going to side with you because you're good friends with them. The sad fact is that just isn't the case. The elders have no extra training about how to deal with any of these matters any more than any regular witness who's just sitting there in the congregation with you. There is a small percentage of elders who do know some of the issues, but the problem you run into is that those elders that do know those things have made excuses for things that you likely do not find to be compelling. And I remember when I was going through my stage of waking up, and even after that, I did have a couple of witnesses ask me, why didn't you go to the elders with this information? They would have been able to help you. But I found that to be a bit ridiculous because I was an elder. I know exactly all the information that elders have to be able to combat this kind of thinking, and it's just non-existent. It's not helpful at all. I knew all of the information that the elders had. I knew all the information that your regular publisher has. And of course, I know all of the information that they don't know. So going to the elders really isn't going to do you any favors. Now, the other reason why I mentioned that it wouldn't be a good idea to go to the elders is because once you do, that now means that the elders in your congregation know that you have doubts, that you've been doing research against the organization, which essentially paints a target on your back. Because now they realize that you can become a danger and a threat to the congregation if you were to go out and to speak to anyone else about the doubts that you have. So if you don't tread carefully here, you can actually find yourself in the situation where you are being invited to a judicial hearing because of your doubts and because of that risk of you speaking to others. Now, having doubts isn't necessarily going to get you into any serious trouble. It's really more or less going to mark you as perhaps being a spiritually weak person who needs some help. But even then, the elders are going to be very cautious around you and are really going to be watching you closely to make sure that you're not talking to anyone else, because, like I said, if you do, at that point, you would then be running the risk of, having to be in a judicial committee. As an example of this, I'll read to you a couple of different things from the elders book. The first one is going to be dealing with what happens when someone's spiritually weak. Perhaps they have doubts about something. And the second one would be, how does the elder book deal with apostates? What do they look for with that? So we could read that now. So the first part comes from chapter 25 of the shepherding book, and particularly bullet points 7 and 8, which is under the subheading called Recognizing Spiritual Weakness. So I'll read to you what those two things are. And so these would be ones that are not necessarily, or they're not judicial issues. They're just things that the elders are going to look for to see if you're perhaps weak. Symptoms of spiritual weakness may include loss of enthusiasm for the truth, neglecting daily Bible reading and personal study or attendance at congregation meetings, missing entire months of field service activity, undue emphasis on the pursuit of pleasure or material things, or criticizing the elders and the organization. When shepherds detect signs of spiritual weakness, they use the scriptures to remind the publisher of the importance of praying for Holy Spirit, reading the Bible daily, studying Christian publications, meditating on scriptural matters, regularly attending meetings, assemblies, and conventions, regularly participating in field service, and being willing to accept spiritual help from those taking the lead. Now, that was the portion that dealt with what they do in a shepherding scenario. But now let's take a look at what happens when perhaps they're considering if someone is actually disassociating themselves, because they do have a little bit of similar language there that still differentiates it from spiritual weakness versus a disassociation or an apostasy matter. In chapter 18 of the shepherding book, it deals entirely with disassociations. But the point that's of interest here is point number 3. And so I'll read that for you so you can see what elders are actually looking for in this particular situation. Actions that may indicate disassociation include the following: making known a firm decision to be known no longer as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. If the individual agrees to meet, a committee, not judicial, should first try to speak with him and provide spiritual assistance. Does he really desire to resign from being one of Jehovah's Witnesses? Or does he simply no longer want to associate actively with the congregation? Is the desire to disassociate prompted by doubts or discouragement? If he is adamant in his decision that he no longer be considered one of Jehovah's Witnesses, he should be asked to put this in writing and sign it. If he does not, then the witnesses to his oral statement should prepare a brief report for the confidential files and sign it. So you can see a little bit of the difference here in the scenario where if you're just playing it safe and kind of showing that you have doubts about something, or perhaps that you just don't necessarily want to be active right now, that gives you a little bit of a safety net and that you wouldn't have to deal with a judicial committee or with a disassociation here. But what can really be tricky in scenarios like this, and with some of the points that we'll be covering, even though these are the types of things that the elder book says, it really varies greatly depending on where you live, and depends on the elders in your congregation and the elder body as a whole, what kind of attitude and demeanor that they have, and how strict are they with things, and will they just kind of go at their own pace, create rules for themselves, because things are not exactly cut and dry across every single congregation. So Your mileage may vary depending on where you are. Now, the final part of the elder book that I wanted to share is actually from chapter 12, which deals with judicial matters. So I'll read for you now the section under apostasy that would apply here so that it would let you know, if you choose to, these are the types of things that you'll need to avoid so you can kind of stay under the radar there. Deliberately spreading teachings contrary to Bible truth. Any with sincere doubts regarding the Bible truth taught by Jehovah's Witnesses should be helped. Loving assistance should be provided. If one obstinately is speaking about or deliberately spreading false teachings, this may be or may lead to apostasy. If there is no response after a first and a second admonition, a judicial committee should be formed. Causing divisions, promoting sex. This would be deliberate action disrupting the unity of the congregation or undermining the confidence of the brothers in Jehovah's arrangement. It may involve or lead to apostasy. So hopefully those rules and things that are in the Elders book may provide you with a little bit extra information to let you know of what some of the boundaries are that you might be able to kind of work around with as you're navigating through this scenario. I have a mix of friends with a wide array of experiences of how they went about trying to help their friends and family members be able to wake up from the organization. Some came out, immediately and tried to talk about everything that they knew about the organization, all these things that they had been finding out. Some of them really didn't say all that much at all and tried to kind of stay below the radar and tried to very slowly speak to their family, their friends, their mates, trying to help them to be able to see the organization that they were a part of. Of course, each of these methods has a varying amount of success, but if I had to make a call on it, I would say the one that has the least amount of success with it is the one where you come out with guns blazing and are just spilling out all of the information, all of these things that you've been finding out. It tends to cause the most amount of problems. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work, because I do have a couple of people that I know that they stuck hard with it and they were able to help their spouse wake up that way. But in the majority of cases, it actually had the opposite effect. So you may be the only one to know what will work with your friends, with your family members, but really consider both options before you pick something, because once you go for the other method of coming out full force, there really is almost no way to pull that back in. So you're probably asking yourself, well, how do I do this? What's the best way to go about it? Well, most of us call it the slow drip method, where it's just little bit by little bit, perhaps in a conversation about something or a comment that might be made. You can try something very small in a comment that you make, kind of in a way testing the water to see how they react to it. But you're not coming in against them, full force, bringing them a ton of information. It might just be a simple idea, a thought about something that can immediately just be brushed off by you, but perhaps leaves a little bit of seed for them to think about and kind of, grow in their mind. But one of the key things to remember about using this is that you do not want to be the one who initiates the conversation about this topic. Because if you start doing that, they're going to notice that you're bringing up negative comments all the time, and it's instantly going to trigger that defense reflex that they have. Those gates are going to come slam down, and you may not have many more opportunities to be able to talk with them. So some key points to remember when you're having these conversations with them is that you do not want to just come out and criticize their faith, criticize the organization, and you definitely don't want to prohibit them from any of their normal spiritual activities in the routine that they have, be it going out in the ministry, going to the meetings, studying, watching the broadcast, whatever it is that they do. Try not to hinder them in doing that. Again, we can think back to what it was like when we were sitting there, listening at the meetings, reading the publications, all of the things that we read about what apostates do, what opposers do. If we were to do those things, that just adds fuel to the fire and feeds the persecution complex that they have. I would recommend that you avoid ever using the word cult. Most of the time when people hear that word, it's taken as a pejorative, an insult. And so that's going to shut down the conversation, is not really going to create a constructive environment for you to be able to have a good conversation with them about it. And it's kind of a problematic word anyway, because your general person out in the population really doesn't fully understand what a cult is, what all the markers of a cult is. So naturally what comes to their mind, they might be thinking of Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, Branch Davidians, groups like that, where perhaps people might be in a little bit more danger. And so the idea of grouping Jehovah's Witnesses in with that kind of a group probably isn't going to do you many favors. So I generally prefer the term high control group or high control fundamentalist group, since that is not ambiguous in any way. It's very clear as to what that is saying, what it's describing. And of course, no witness could actually deny what that is when you go and look up what the markers are of a high control group. It's really important that you be realistic in your expectations of what's going to happen in your conversations with people. You have to remember that it is most likely taking you months, if not years, to be able to wake up from the indoctrination that you've been raised up to believe. You have to keep in mind that for the vast majority of people, you cannot wake them up unless they are ready. It reminds me of something that Morpheus said to Neo in the movie The Matrix. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged, and many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system that they will fight to protect it. They have to already be in a frame of mind that will allow them to even consider the terrifying possibility that their entire worldview, all these things that they have learned for their entire life, might be wrong and they have to change. Remind yourself of how high control groups work. They actively prey on people who perhaps have social issues, economic issues, have experienced some kind of tragedy in their lives. And it's because they find themselves at that lower point that they're actually willing to perhaps consider making a change for something that otherwise they might not have ever done. And so just like in those scenarios, it takes that kind of a jolt to make them change their mind. Well, the reverse of that is true, that it might take a similar kind of a jolt, something to happen in their life to make them realize that they're a part of something that isn't what it seems. So when the time comes for you to actually have a conversation with them, or perhaps when you know maybe little bits of chances are going to arise for you to say a sentence or two about something, you need to be fully prepared to do this. And one of the ways that I found out to be the most helpful is that you have to rehearse everything constantly. And this is especially critical because you really don't know when an opportunity is going to come up when you can have a conversation with someone. So this is exactly what I did whenever I went for a walk, went for a run, went for a bike ride. When I was driving around in my car, I probably looked like I was insane, but everywhere I went, I was actually rehearsing what I was going to say when I found myself in that conversation. So I was talking out loud to myself, going through some of the things that I would say, what I had researched, trying to really trim the words down, make sure I said things correctly so that when I talked with them, that I wouldn't be flustered, that I knew exactly what I wanted to say because it was so well rehearsed. But in addition to thinking about the things that I was going to say, I also had to anticipate what their responses were going to be. So I had to jump on the other side of the conversation too, argue against that point, and then jump back to my side and figure out what would I say in response to that. Now, one of the things that you also have to rehearse for here is how you're going to respond, how you're going to keep your cool when they start using logic and excuses that just make no sense whatsoever. So really practice maintaining a calm demeanor and not allowing yourself to get worked up and angry over some of the things that they say. Now, obviously, if you're rehearsing all of these things, it requires that you have to do all the research yourself. Now, that doesn't mean you need to know every single thing that's happened that witnesses do behind the scenes, the things that they've taught over the years. It mostly means that you need to figure out what topics that you think that your loved ones, your family members, your friends, what are the things that might come up in conversation? What are the things that are going to be important to them that might shock them if they found out about, or perhaps if they started researching it, that might rattle them a bit. So you really need to be sure that you understand what a lot of the main points are, in addition to what they would say as a response to that. To help you do that, I do plan on doing a video here sometime soon dealing with how to do research and provide you with some of the sources that I've used that I found helpful since my time waking up. Now, sadly, I do have to point out that even if you do everything absolutely right and perfect, you bring up everything in the best possible way, your chances of success at waking up your family and friends are vanishingly small. Remember how you would have felt if someone came to you with apostate ideas. When that would have happened to you, you would have instantly been put on the defense. You wouldn't have listened to anything because that's exactly what you've been trained to do. So the odds are highly stacked against you. Now, take my case as an example. I didn't talk to anyone about the reasons for my doubts as to why I stepped down as an elder, why I started my fade out process, other than the two elders that I had to talk to in order to step down, and one other person who I needed to let know about my issues. And even doing so, I only gave very minor details, things that really wouldn't have been too shocking to them. And I continued telling them, like, hey, I'm perfectly happy for you to continue on as Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm not going to hinder you in any way. But despite me doing that and giving all of that, it still didn't work. So really, the results that you're going to have are mostly going to be guided by each individual person and how receptive they are to new ideas and to change. So I hope you found some of these tips at least a little bit helpful to be able to give you some ideas of what you should do and should not do in trying to wake up your family and friends. To help even further with that, my next video is going to deal with something called street epistemology and how to use it, particularly with Jehovah's Witnesses. So look for that coming sometime soon. But in the meantime, again, like always, if you'd like to see more, please like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.